Changes are coming to how people can vote this coming November. Earlier this week, the state of Texas agreed to loosen its voter ID laws after a federal court ruled they were unconstitutional. Now, under the agreement, Texas voters with no ID will have to sign an affidavit before casting a ballot. And the state will spend at least $2.5 million on voter outreach. A federal judge still needs to approve those changes. So joining me now this morning to break it all down is Byron Henry. He's a local attorney and a constitutional scholar. Byron, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So let's break it down plain and simple. What will be different this November?
Well, not a whole lot. Despite a lot of reports and commentary, the Court of Appeals did not strike down Texas's voter ID law.
Okay.
What it did was basically say that it had a disparate impact predominantly on minorities, African Americans, and Hispanics. Therefore, for those who did not have a picture ID or a photo ID on the list of items that are allowed under the voter ID law, those people would be allowed to cast a ballot in November even if they did not have one of the listed photo IDs, so long as they verified by affidavit, as you mentioned, that they do not have one of the photo IDs that is allowed for voting, and they had a reasonable impediment to obtaining one, meaning we don't have one and we can't really get one without without difficulty. They'll be allowed for the first time since the voter ID law was in effect to cast a regular ballot instead of a provisional ballot.
Okay, so how will this change then? Folks who maybe were considering not voting, how do you think this will now encourage them to go out and vote?
Well, as part of the deal, I believe the state of Texas is agreeing to spend, I think it's at this point, $2.5 million, which is not a whole lot considering the size of the state of Texas, but with all the publicity, it may be sufficient to let voters know that as long as they're in that group that do not have a photo ID and cannot obtain one, they do not have to stay away from the polls.
Okay, so now what efforts, if any, are in place to help folks who may not have the means to get to the polls actually get there to vote?
Well, with respect to getting to the polls, this issue really isn't about them getting to the polls, though one of the issues in the case was whether or not they had reasonable access to the offices necessary to get their birth certificate and obtain either a photo ID or an election identification certificate. That was part of the argument, is that the transportation for some low income and some minorities made it too difficult for them to attain photo ID. But in this case, they'll need to get themselves to the polls, but if they can sign that affidavit that they don't have one of the IDs and they couldn't get one and present some form of identification, that's important. They will have to bring a registration card, a phone bill, any type of government document that has their name and address on it. But if they can do that, they will be allowed to cast a regular ballot in November's election. So
in your opinion, is this enough? Is this fair? More fair?
It's difficult to say. I mean, the opinion was narrow. The voter ID law remains in effect, and they really focused on this small percentage of voters, up to 600,000 in Texas, that may not have a photo ID and cannot get one. So in that respect, it addresses the problem that the plaintiffs brought in their lawsuit and allows those people to cast a ballot. The state of Texas just needs to broadcast that and advertise it so that they know that they can do so.
Gotcha. And so let me get your expert opinion on this. The election, how things are headed, where they're going. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly all the voter ID opinions you're seeing across the country, people believe that in some states especially, this is going to be a very close, hard-fought election, not just at the presidential level, but down the ballot with the balance of the Senate in play. And therefore, this fight over who can vote and advertising that you can vote with an ID, without an ID, in an attempt to bring more people to the polls, keep people away from the polls, whatever your position is on voter ID, both sides are taking it very seriously to keep the ballot integrity intact so people understand that their vote matters and that it will count.
All right, Byron Henry, thank you so much for joining us this morning.